Howdy, I'm Tim Hartmann for Aggie Horticulture here with Justin Scheiner, and we are talking Asian persimmons today. So if you've ever had a persimmon before, you might think of persimmon as being this little bitty fruit native to the eastern part of the state that if you put it in your mouth, you instantly regret it. But we're going to talk about a different species of persimmon, produces large fruit, very delicious, and actually pretty easy to grow too.
Yeah, so it's almost Halloween here, and this tree looks like it has some little pumpkins on it. So if you've driven around in October, November, after the leaves have fallen, maybe even December, and you see these trees with these little orange globes hanging on them, odds are it's Asian persimmon. And this is one of the easier fruits that we can grow, and it's one of the few that ripen this time of the season. And so we're looking at a row of persimmons here behind us. Every tree is a different variety. The one immediately behind us is 4 years old. So this is fairly typical of growth. It does vary quite a bit by variety. There's a lot of different varieties of persimmons out there, and they do vary quite a bit in their characteristics. So most of you in Texas who are watching this do have an opportunity to grow persimmons, but there are some limitations. And so let's talk about what are some of the things to look for if you wanted to plant one of these, maybe variety, site, etc.
Yeah, so like with any fruit tree, we have to have a decent amount of sun. We said at least 6 hours of sun per day. Persimmons do need drainage, okay? We plant persimmons that are generally going to be grafted onto our eastern, that is our native persimmon, that's Diospyros virginiana. And that's a tree that can take it can take some heavy soil, but we still need to have decent drainage. Okay, so we want a site that's going to have drainage. If not, you want to plant up on a bit of a berm, like we've talked about in the past. Cold hardiness can be an issue for some varieties, but generally for Texas, we're going to be in good shape. One good thing about persimmon compared to some other fruit crops is that it has a low chilling requirement. It really doesn't need a whole lot of that cold to be able to flower and fruit successfully the next year. However, it does need quite a bit of warm weather. So for most of these persimmons, there are a few exceptions, but generally they tend to bloom pretty late, much later than things like peaches and blueberries. And so generally we don't have problems with spring frost on them because they do bloom late. So pretty easy in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these, we're in College Station, and these don't really get sprayed with anything. So nothing is totally pest and disease free. So there are pests from time to time, caterpillars and things like that. June beetles will feed on these as well. But as far as fruit grow, these are fairly low input as far as the requirements, and that's a good thing for most homeowners. And if you look at this tree right here, you can see the volume of fruit that it's bearing. I don't know what this would be if I weighed it out, but each one of these fruits is going to be somewhere around 1/4 to maybe even 1/3 of a pound for this particular variety. The size of the fruit can vary a lot by variety. It can also vary quite a bit based on how much fruit the tree is actually carrying. And so one thing to consider, whether you're growing persimmons or peaches or anything else for that matter, is when you plant your young tree, they'll often try to bear that same year. You'll see some fruit, and it's exciting, and you want to keep the fruit a lot of times to look at it, maybe taste your first harvest, but you're much better off thinning that fruit as early as you can. You could even thin the flowers off if you recognize them. And the reason we want to do that is because you can see all the energy that was put into this fruit right here for this tree. When it's a young tree, we want that energy to go into the roots. We want it to go into the shoots and develop a sizable tree before we actually start to crop it.
And one other thing about Asian persimmons is that they are actually separate male and female trees. Okay, so what we're looking at here is actually a female specimen. However, it's able to produce fruit parthenocarpically, that is without seed. And that is really nice for us when we're growing fruit because we like fruit and we don't want to have to deal with seed. And while we can sometimes get some seed set from some native trees in the vicinity, some males that provide pollination, generally these are going to be without seed, which is really nice. One thing to keep in mind, on the one hand, we don't want to have fruit on a young tree because we want to invest in vegetative growth, establish that tree. But at the same time, when these trees are fairly young, especially year 3 or 4 is when they start to get into production. Because these fruit don't have seed, they can be fairly sensitive to stress, like water and heat stress. And so we do want to make sure that we keep them happy, because these seedless fruit are a little more prone to dropping because they don't have that signal in them.
Yeah, in here, to mitigate some of the water drought stress, I've got some mulch. It also adds soil organic matter, and there's also some weed suppression if you have enough mulch here. So this is hardwood mulch, and every year I'll renew it and add a little more. The major reason I do it is because of water. Our water quality here is not great, so I try to minimize the volume of water that's required. So as he mentioned, if we have some serious stress, it'll start to drop some fruit. But relatively speaking, how would you characterize the drought tolerance of persimmon?
I would say pretty decent, especially compared to definitely compared to some of our other crops.
Yeah, so if you do want a backyard fruit that's fairly easy to grow, reasonably low maintenance, you may give persimmons a try. And when you're looking at the varieties, we talked about seedlessness. There are some varieties like Eureka that
can set seed.
The size of the fruit is also a factor.
Shape of the fruit.
And then as far as the flavor goes, there's a range in flavors. And it's a little more complicated to say there's only 2 types, but most of the time when we talk about persimmons, we talk about astringent varieties, and then we talk about non-astringent varieties. All right, now we move down the row a little bit to a different variety here, and you can see this thing is absolutely loaded up with fruit. And in comparison to what it would be if we had thinned it, these fruit are probably quite a bit smaller, and there's a chance that they're not going to ripen or have as much sugar or sweetness when they do ripen. And one other problem with doing this and not coming in and thinning this out, which I'm guilty, I did not, is that you can see these branches are starting to weep. And the branches being weighted down, weeping like this for a few months here, a lot of times that will change the shape of the tree. And so now this tree is going to have a weeping shape. I'm going to have some branches here now that are eventually going to touch the ground, so I'm probably going to have to prune those out later on to keep the tree off the ground, because really you don't want any fruit sitting on the ground.
Another thing this can do is can just overall weaken the tree. With some crops we can see alternate bearing, where too much energy goes into this year, we don't get enough vegetative growth, and basically the plant is tired and it's not able to produce as much fruit, or very little fruit, in the following year. Another thing we worry about a little bit, not so much with persimmons, is that if this thing is really overcropped and really weak going into the winter time, and we have a really cold winter, we could have more damage than we might normally see. So
yeah, and at this point it's a little late to thin. So we're not going to get a lot, because the tree's already invested a lot of energy in these. And so if you're trying to thin something to get maybe a larger tree size, you planted that new tree like we talked about earlier, the earlier you thin it, the better off you are. One other thing I would like to point out, and it's in the background here, is you can see a really upright variety. This is a characteristic of Sage-O. It's very upright. You can see how it differs from this one, tends to be a little more spreading. The Sage-O tree actually behind us is 1 year younger than these trees right here. It's in a very vegetative state. You can see that it's put on a lot of shoot growth here. And so, Tim, if you were going to prune this tree after leaf fall, would you prune it first of all? Do these need to be pruned? And maybe, what would you look for? What would you try to do here?
So commercially there is some pruning done, where you will actually develop different tiers with scaffold limbs just to make a stronger framework for the tree. But generally in Texas we don't do a lot of pruning on persimmons. We might open it up a little bit just to get more light in there for fruit production.
All right, now we've talked enough about growing these things. These are a good option for you as far as a low input fruit. They ripen in the fall. They're pretty aesthetic. Now let's taste some fruit. We talked about this native persimmon Virginiana earlier, and we've got some fruit. And there is a slight difference in size, as you can see, between giant Hanafuyu versus our native persimmon here. This native species fruit size can be larger than this, but one thing to point out, and probably the thing that most people know about it, is if you eat this puppy before it is fully mature, fully ripe, you're going to get puckered up because of the astringency. Whereas there are varieties, like we talked about earlier, that are non-astringent and you can eat them while they're still hard. These persimmons that we actually have here, I prefer them when they're a little bit softer. These are quite hard, but they're not going to be astringent. However, there are astringent varieties that you do have to let hang longer until that astringency goes away. But there's some tricks also that you can do to reduce the astringency. And Dr. Hartmann is going to tell you what some of those tricks are.
Yeah, so like we talked about, these are non-astringent varieties. The astringent varieties they're not quite ready right now, but they have a lot of tannins. Okay, this is what makes them really bitter. So just like if you'd bite into this native fruit, it has to get completely ripe. It has to soften. Okay, and even once these get completely ripe, the skin still retains this bitterness, this astringency. Okay, so we don't want to bite into the skin. We still have to either peel them or kind of scoop out the goo, if you will.
Do you want to demonstrate on this?
No, that's a little bit soft. I mean, a little bit firm still. You can if you want. You can bite into that. But so one thing that people will do, one trick, is you can actually put them in the freezer for about 24 hours. There are some other treatments, some gas treatments you can apply. Generally, though, if you just let them sit on the counter for a week to 10 days, the astringent varieties will ripen. They will get soft. But freezing them does help to stimulate that ripening process and kind of speed it up a little bit.
And what I like to do is, as soon as they start reaching a point where the flavor is good, the non-astringent varieties, I like to go ahead and start picking them, ripen them on the counter, because if it's warmer inside your house than it is outside, we're talking about the fall time, they're going to typically ripen faster. So you can pick the fruit, you can soften them to whatever you want, and then you can eat. And eat on the tree probably over a month or longer period of time than that.
And the good thing about taking them off the tree as early as you can, as soon as they reach that maturity, they're tree ripe, is there are a lot of other animals besides us that really love these fruit. And so raccoons, possums, squirrels love to go after these things. So as soon as they get ripe, the sooner you can pick them, the better if you've got varmint problems.
All right, last question before we dig in. Skin or no skin? Do you eat the skin or do you not eat the skin?
Well, I would not eat the skin as I talked about on this one, but one of the things that's really cool about these non-astringent varieties, like the Fuyu types, the Sarugua, is that the skin, once it's ripe, it loses its astringency. So these non-astringent varieties, the ones that remain basically firm when they're ripe, we can eat the skin just like it's an apple because we don't have that astringency in there. So in other words, we don't have to peel them, we don't have to let them turn into mush and scoop them into a bowl or something. We can eat them like we would most other fruit.
Okay, I don't eat the skin because I find it to be similar to wax paper, something like that in consistency. But if they're softened, like this one is softened, and you try to peel it, you end up with a mess, a lot of juice. It's a lot easier to peel these ones that are still firm like this. So let's go ahead and taste this. This is giant Hanafuyu. I mean, this is a large fruit.
They'll get even larger.
Yeah, they will. And as you saw earlier, some of those trees were overcropped or had a really heavy crop. So fruit size is probably going to be down just because it's hanging so many individual persimmons on there. I'll give you the first piece.
And I'm not quite as picky when it comes to my fruit, so I don't mind eating the skin on these.
So this is crunchy and crispy. I prefer it softer. The flavor, I think, is more complex. But what are you tasting in there, Dr. Hartmann?
Mostly persimmon. But I'm getting some notes of other things in there too. I'm getting maybe a little pumpkin, but maybe it's just because it's fall, and the orange thing, and they look like little pumpkins. But
interesting. Pumpkin.
I'm definitely getting lots of persimmon though. Sweet, fruity, not overly acidic. These tend to be pretty low acid, so mainly just getting the sweetness.
I would say this one's pretty mild flavored. When they're really ripe, and it depends on the variety. The varieties differ, greatly in their flavors. But a lot of times they'll have a nutty type of flavor to me, and I really like that.
All right, I'm getting a few nuts. Yeah.
So we'll make this fast. We have a different variety right here. And I have softened this one quite nicely because I picked it maybe about a week or so ago. Now, what variety is it? I don't remember. And not all varieties are easy to tell just based off of the shape of the fruit itself. But this one is really juicy. And the flesh is going to be a lot softer than the skin, which is one reason why I prefer not to have the skin on there. But we'll go ahead and eat it with the skin.
Definitely softer. Reminds me a little more of the astringent varieties like Hachia or Tamopan, some of the ones that I grew up with. And yeah, this has got a good rich flavor.
Rich, sugary, almost a brown sugar, and then a hint of maybe some pecan or something like that as far as the flavor goes. But it's unlike most other fruits, I think, in flavor. And in fact, there's not a common fruit that I would compare the flavor profile to, I don't think.
And some people aren't crazy about them just because the flavor, they would consider them maybe a little bland in the sense that they don't have a lot of acid, like most peaches and kiwi fruit, things like that. But they're just a nice kind of sweet.
Messy?
They can be messy. Do we want to talk about one of our?
You go ahead. Tell them the joke.
So we had Dr. Jerry Parsons, who many of y'all still know, just a legendary horticulturist in the San Antonio area, worked with a lot of fruit and vegetable crops. And Dr. Parsons would always say, especially speaking about the astringent varieties that have to become fully soft before they're ripe, he would always say that you have to strip down naked and eat them in a bathtub just because you've got the juice and the goo just running all over you, and so you can kind of get or you may not want to get that impression, that imagery, but sometimes they can be kind of messy, and so that's one advantage of the non-astringent is you can eat them when they're still fairly firm or just starting to get soft like this.
So if you look at this fruit, you can eat almost the whole thing because this is seedless. I mean, you can peel it, which I prefer it peeled, especially when it's soft inside like this. But I mean, that's a lot of fruit. I bet this probably weighed a third of a pound or something. Nice snack. And again, you can eat on these things for a fairly long period of time. So it's one of our fewer fall fruit that's ripe in around Halloween time. A little earlier, even a little later. We can pick this thing all the way through even after frost until we get a really hard freeze. It holds up pretty well on the tree.
Yeah, as long as you don't get a hard freeze, that can damage the fruit, drop them. But yeah, they'll last a long time. They're highly ornamental. These beautiful orange fruit. The leaves can have a nice color sometimes in the fall. Once the leaves are gone, you have these beautiful showy orange fruit, which of course are very noticeable to the varmints, but we love this fruit. Be advised that some of the varieties, like Eureka, for example, can set seed if there is a male persimmon in the vicinity, like a native, the American Diospyros virginiana plant. So some will set seed, but usually not a real big deal.
All right, last thing before we go, I am going to try this native persimmon. You may or may not be able to see this. We'll zoom in here. You can see there's seed. Most of this fruit is seed. When they're actually fully ripe, they're pretty good.
Really good flavor. Very good
There's
flavor.
just not nearly as much to it. But when you eat them at this stage, even though it's orange and looks ripe, you bite into it, it's delayed reaction. My mouth feels like it's full of cotton balls at this point. It's all those tannins in there. Tannins are the same thing you find in wine or in really strong coffee, but this, I promise you, is going to be worse than wine or coffee.
Not a pleasant experience
That you've ever tasted. So we better go now before I start drooling on myself.
And one thing I do want to mention about the native persimmon is the fact that they do have all these seeds is really nice because this is the preferred rootstock species. We graft the Asian species onto this, so this is a good source for rootstock.
All right, for more information, you can check out our website at
aggiehorticulture.tamu.edu and look for the fruit and nut resources.
I can barely talk.